Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin by expressing my very deep appreciation for this invitation to speak here this afternoon. I must confess, however, that I'm a little puzzled by it because my specialization is the history of ancient India, and I'm really not so sure that I know anything at all about conflict resolution and the development problems of the world today. But for what it's worth, I'm going to say my say. Thank you for the introduction, and I hope somewhere along the line, what I have to say links up with what is being discussed here. I would like to argue that historians today need to recognize that they have a role in society as public intellectuals. This disallows historians from retiring comfortably to an ivory tower. Instead, it requires them to be aware of what is being claimed as history. Some of those that make this claim require a history not as a curiosity about the past or an explanation of the past, but to bolster up their political ideologies. Where this is fraudulent history, it has to be countered by historians with theories based on a critical inquiry into sources and arguments foundational to the discipline of history. In a sense, therefore, historians have to protect their discipline. This is normally done by writing reliable history using acknowledged methodologies. In addition, now, there is a need for acquainting the public with what we mean by historical writing. In explaining how it can be differentiated from popular fantasies about the past, we have to provide a socio-economic context of the event and to analyze the context. Such fantasies are frequently related to varieties of nationalisms, often tied to religion, language, ethnicity, and supportive of particular dominant groups. These, in turn, are used to nurture the politics of identity, a type of politics that is very common and frequent today. It is also tied to nationalism, as I said, and nationalism was associated with constructing a new kind of community. It established its identity through what has been held out as a shared past, reflected in a shared history and culture. Eric Hobsbawm speaks of the relationship of history to nationalism and as comparable to what the poppy means to the heroin addict. The interdependence is very close, and history is a major source of identity. The new nationalist identity of the 19th century in Europe was in part initially linked to the emergence of a middle class as a recognizable social category, coinciding with the growth of both capitalism and its counterpart, colonialism. Together with this came the demand for democratic and representative government. The question of identity became crucial to claiming the inheritance of power. It has been said that nationalism needed the concept of the nation much as the nation needed nationalism. There is a parallel situation to this among societies that have experienced colonialism, and this is where my focus will be. In the colonial reconstruction of history of its colony, existing interpretations of the past were set aside. New communities were created from the emergence of the middle class in each colony. Inevitably, such communities internalized the history that had been constructed for them by the colonial power. Creating an identity became crucial, and history moved to center stage. Nationalism, frequently anti-colonial, was among the ideologies of the colonized, but they tended not to question this history constructed for them, at least not initially. I would like to illustrate my argument by recourse to events in India over the last 2 centuries. Colonial scholarship had come to terms with multiple and various identities in the subcontinent. For example, with the differing patterns of caste stratification in different parts of the territory, and with the multiplicity of religious sects, since Indian religions, unlike the European, were not monolithic. But colonial scholars, therefore, found it convenient to invent monolithic religious groups, of which 2 were viewed as prominent. These became the protagonists of history that dominated colonial historical explanation as interpreted by colonial historians. The colonial understanding of the Indian past was intended to support colonial policy. 2 defining theories were readily adopted. One came to be called the two-nation theory. It was argued by James Mill and utilitarian philosophers that India consisted of 2 nations, the Hindu and the Muslim, that had always invariably been mutually hostile. The coming of the colonial power, they said, ended the tyranny of Muslim rule over a largely Hindu population. The Hindus, being the largest in number, were the majority community, whereas others were minorities, of which the Muslim was the largest. The actual and the more extensive multiplicity of communities and of religious sects was ignored in this historical reconstruction. It was unfamiliar to the colonizers, and it was irrelevant, above all, to colonial policy. The emerging Indian middle class accepted religion as the main identity of the communities. The coexistence of many religions subsequently became the definition of the Indian version of secularism. The other theory that took root from colonial scholarship was the theory of Aryan race. Colonial scholars and many Orientalists in Europe argued that the foundations of Indian civilization lay in the Aryan culture, superior to all others, as described in the Vedic texts, and was therefore Hindu. Please note that this is happening in the latter half of the 19th century, when similar ideas are being developed in Europe. Among its many proponents, the theory of the Aryan race, was Max Müller, who stated that the Aryans came to India from their homeland in Central Asia. And Colonel Olcott held that the Aryans did not come to India, but were indigenous to India and traveled west to civilize the world. But despite both these theories, it was interest in establishing a secular democracy that encouraged the larger and more effective nationalism, the secular anti-colonial nationalism. This has rightly been accorded the status of mainstream nationalism. This was the force that was mobilized to liberate the colony from colonial rule and establish its independence. But the 2 colonial theories gave rise to subsidiary nationalisms in addition, and in the 1920s. They grew at varying points of time to play a role that has become today central to contemporary politics in South Asia. These were movements rooted in religious extremism, going back to the colonial interest in religious communities, and are therefore called by various names ranging from communalism, religious nationalism, to communal fascism, and even pseudo-nationalism. These communal nationalisms supported the two-nation theory and used religion as their identity. Their enemy was not the colonial power, but each other. Extremist nationalisms, when not anti-colonial, generally require an enemy within the nation. They were anxious to establish religion-based nation-states. The Muslim League worked towards the creation of an Islamic state. It finally succeeded with the establishing of Pakistan in 1947. The Hindu Mahasabha, superseded by what is today called the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, wishes to make India into a Hindu state. The justification sought for setting up two separate states was different in each case. Muslim communalism argued that in a single state, the Hindu majority would victimize the Muslim minority. Therefore, the Muslims needed a separate state. Hindu communalism argued that they were the indigenous peoples and the majority community basing themselves on the theory of Aryan origins and the Aryans being Hindu. The land was claimed as that of their ancestors and their religion. Muslims and Christians on both counts were foreigners, since it was said that they came from outside India and their religion was also alien. This despite the fact that the population is about, today, 80% Hindu, but 20% is of Muslim, Christian, and other religions. Hindus, therefore, it was argued, had the right to be the primary citizens in a Hindu state. The ideology of these religious or communal nationalisms included the rights of only a single religious group. They legitimized their ideology by basing it on the colonial reconstruction of Indian history. What colonial scholarship failed to recognize was the link to caste. The distance between the upper castes and the lower castes was insurmountable, combining economic disparity with the notion of ritual pollution. This was common to all religions in India, including Islam and Christianity. Social confrontation was therefore more fierce than religious confrontation, and colonial scholarship, completely unfamiliar with caste disparities and what they meant socially, got the story completely wrong. But since their incorrect reading was foundational to the history they constructed, that history, however erroneous, found its way into the nationalisms based on religious identities. History was viewed as a millennium-long conflict between Hindus and Muslims. The utopias were either when the rulers were Hindu, for the Hindu population, and when the rulers were Muslims, for the Muslim religious population. After independence in 1947, it was assumed that since the secular anti-colonial nationalism had spearheaded the movement for independence, secular history would prevail. The primary identity of this nationalism was Indian. It was neither Hindu nor Muslim. It incorporated people of all religious castes and languages as equal. This was, in a sense, a new identity. But in present times, Hindu religious nationalism is carrying forward the colonial interpretation of Indian history. Such nationalisms, in order to succeed, have to silence not only the minorities, but also those that question the kind of supposed history that supports the establishing of religion-based states. Those of us that question these attempts are dismissed very readily as Marxist, irrespective of whether we are or not. And this for the religious nationalists becomes a word of abuse. Anybody they wish to attack, they say, oh, they're Marxists. Occasionally, the rather quaint word from the days of the Cold War, commie, is also used. These popular histories are being proclaimed now as indigenous histories. They are counterposed to academic history, that is, dismissed as being an imitation of what is written by Western historians. The irony is rich, since in their own kind of history, their own kind of history is rooted actually in colonial readings, the readings that academic historians are currently questioning. Historians in India in recent times have had to defend their history from religious extremists and from the antipathy of such extremists to intellectual liberalism. I have focused on the Indian situation, but this is not confined to India, as we know. It can be present and often is in other countries, especially ex-colonies. The question is, how do we protect the right to research and publish what we think is relevant? So far, at least in India, it is not an absolutely desperate situation. We can publish what we want to, despite the fact that occasionally our books are banned. And the demands are made for more and more banning of more and more books. And we just hope that publishers will have the courage to go on publishing them. But when the intervention takes the form of controlling what is to be taught, as is now beginning to happen, then the problem becomes more severe. As we know from much experience all over the world, the pattern is recognizable. It begins with specific changes in school textbooks. We have had to battle this at intervals over the last 40 years. The next step is a curriculum for graduate and postgraduate studies controlled by a central governmental authority and uniformly applicable to all universities. This step is under discussion. Many ex-colonial societies today are experiencing acute political and intellectual confrontations in the name of a variety of nationalisms. These emanate from an understanding of history as it was developed by colonial scholarship, but which is being challenged by post-colonial scholarship. When history gets enmeshed in politics via identity politics, then the historian has to differentiate between analytical history and narratives that fantasize the past. And we have to explain the difference between the two. The methodology of the study of history crosses borders with ease, but the construction of new methodologies and the application of these to particular histories can become problematic, where the authority concerned tries to control what is written. Differentiated religious and cultural forms exist in most societies. The differences coexist as entities, or get amalgamated, or confront each other, or create new forms. As historians, we also have to see the interstices of various patterns of living and explain how and why they change. This requires sensitivity to the spaces that they create and an observation of how they arrive at the identities that they construct. It also requires that such explanations should reach the public so as to make people better acquainted with the processes that go into their making. These are the issues, it seems to me, that confront the historian in the role of a public intellectual. In doing so, we have to unpack some of the baggage. We as historians have to unpack some of the baggage of history that has traveled with us over many centuries. Let me just try and give you 3 examples. Conflict situations today arise often from border disputes, especially where borders today are cartographically defined. In history, and I'm seeing it from the perspective of someone who's studying history way back many centuries ago, in history, this is a recent practice. 4 centuries ago and earlier, there was no cartography-supported borders, and the disputes were of a different kind. Perhaps when we talk about border disputes today, we should go back in time and look at what was meant by borders before cartography determined the line that makes the border. A question of a different kind is that of political ideologies that characterized kingdoms but did not create identities. This is a very major difference between pre-modern kingdoms and the states that we have today. Religion is mentioned. Religion was an important part of the old kingdoms, but it had 2 aspects, and these are aspects that, again, we must refer to repeatedly. Religious authorities in themselves were often creating conflicts. Let's not forget that religion has both its positive and negative aspects. I'm talking about organized religion. Secondly, religious authorities were also confronting the state. And these are all areas of discussion, whether we're talking about Christianity in Europe, or Islam in the Middle East, or Hinduism in India, or Buddhism in India and China, and so on. These are all aspects that need attention. It is not religion itself that historians have to explain to the public, but also the politics of religious institutions and organizations, both in the past and the present. And my 3rd example is that for those of us who work on pre-modern history, we have already introduced the notion of history, at least without borders. I'm talking about concepts of civilization and the way those concepts are today being questioned by historians. In questioning the concept of civilization, what was referred to yesterday as these neat blocks that traverse the world, we have been challenging the frontiers, we've been challenging the priorities of earlier historical writing. Civilizational blocks are being discarded, and within large areas, we are discovering porous points of extensive interconnectedness, sometimes across half the world. Taking Eurasia as the example, there is the Silk Route that cuts across the central parts of Eurasia, cutting into these blocks: Chinese civilization, Indian civilization, Islamic civilization, the Mediterranean. Now we also have the great maritime route that goes from Africa to Egypt, to India, to Ceylon, to Southeast Asia, to China, cutting into these civilizational blocks and making it quite clear that they were not in any way isolated examples. They were very much interconnected without the borders that we like to link to them. Connections across Eurasia, both overland and by sea, reject the idea of well-defined civilizational blocks, characterized, as we have been taught in school, by a single language, a single religion, and clearly demarcated territory. This is becoming a very doubtful historical projection. In the making of a civilization, it is sometimes startling to discover that what we had earlier dismissed as the barbarian, the non-civilized, not us, them, that category turns out to be the catalyst in what we regard as being civilized. so that relationship too between what is civilized and what is not is coming under question and discussion. This early globalization, which many of us refer to as globalization before globalization with a capital G, did not end history, as Fukuyama would have maintained, but in fact moved it into a new phase. And that is what the historian would like to talk about, how all this change in attitudes to civilization will now make us think of a new phase today. What do we then do with the grand narratives of nationalism and civilization? This will be our problem today. We historians, to conclude, we historians are sometimes left asking the question, whose history are we defending anyway? And today, this question becomes central in the minds of the historian, and particularly the historian who is also a public intellectual. Thank you.